Good afternoon and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we're joined by NYGBB President D. Joshua Taylor and State Archivist Tom Ruller for a discussion of how to utilize different types of archives and how various records can be woven together to tell a complete story. Josh Taylor, president of the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society, is a nationally known and recognized genealogical author, lecturer, and researcher. Joshua is deeply passionate about family history, is a frequent speaker at family history events across the globe, and hosts the popular PBS series, Genealogy Roadshow. Tom Ruller has been New York State Archivist since 2015. Tom is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form, on which subjects he has consulted with several state governments and other organizations. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So those of you who are joining us today, please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box, please. And we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Josh and Tom.
Thank you, Josie. And hello to everyone. This is going to be a fun conversation, I think, Josh. I think you probably more than anyone has experience with the huge, I don't want to say the myriad kinds of repositories that exist, not just here in New York, but across the country. And I think a lot of folks don't know about the untapped resources that are available. And
yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation as well. I mean, you know, I think there's a lot out there to be discovered in places that you might not consider looking. So I'm really looking forward to diving in.
Exactly. And I think that's the key, to discover the interesting people about New York and the stories that aren't necessarily instantly surfaced or often told. You've got to go to these different kinds of repositories and different kinds of institutions. And I think as Josie talked about at the very beginning, you know, as part of the introduction, in order to paint the complete picture of someone's life, you've got to knit together a lot of different resources. That's how you get at the truth, is putting one thing connected to another.
You know, absolutely. I think one of the things that's really important, especially with New York, with the people and the places of New York, is, you know, it isn't just always about someone's birth, marriage, or their death. It's all the years in between and all the records that exist that help to document those stories.
Exactly. Well, we've put together a little PowerPoint that kind of highlights where some of these resources might be. So I'm going to do my best to use the technology to bring that forward. And hopefully, fingers crossed, this is going to work. And as we talked about at the very beginning, if this were a live program 25 years ago, we'd have to make sure we have a spare light bulb in our overhead projector. So since we don't have to worry about that, we get to worry about something different. And so here we go. New York's places and people. So let's talk a little bit about the kinds of repositories that exist across the state. And I think the one that is usually at the top of the list often are local governments. You know, there are 2,500 units of local government across the state. And those local governments keep all kinds of interesting and important records. I'm just going to point out the building that I took the photo of here. This is the Fulton County Courthouse, built in 1772. So this year, it's celebrating its 250th anniversary. And we're really excited to be part of the celebration of the Fulton County Courthouse, which is located up in Johnstown, New York. But this isn't a history lesson on courthouses. This is really about records. And you know, the kinds of resources that those 2,500 units of local government can have range. At the county level, there's naturalization records. There's real property ownership records, which are probably some of the most important and heavily used resources. And again, most of those county clerks have an open records room. And many of those county clerks have digitized those records and they're available online. I find that to be a really exciting prospect, is going through deeds and mortgages and other real property records that the county clerks have. You don't have to leave your house.
Right. And Tom, that's such an important point. I was in Sullivan County, New York, about a year and a half ago, and I was doing research, and the records for a particular year that I needed were not online and were not on microfilm. And I really miss being able to sit at home and sort of work with those documents. But what I really loved is being in the courthouse, because while I found the deed records and the mortgages I was looking for, I went down the hall to sort of the maps area, and they were able to help me walk the property through to what it looked like in the present day and point me out to the road I need to drive down so that I could visit the property again. And that's the type of real expertise that sits within those local government institutions. So, I didn't have a trip to that department on my list that day, but sure enough, it was there and waiting for me.
And so of the New York's 62 counties, a number of them have set up dedicated archives where they've got staff and it's a research room and all that. Here in Albany County Hall of Records has a research room. The Westchester County has set up an archives. Warren County has set up an archives. And at some of the towns and cities and villages across the state, that kind of situation has occurred as well. Saratoga County, or the city of Saratoga Springs, has set up an archive, again, to facilitate access to those records. And I think, as you point out, the people at the local level are excited to share the stories and enable you to get access to those records.
Yeah, and sometimes, that there are records that we might not necessarily anticipate finding. You might find a version of a tax record or a school record or an account book from 150 years ago that you didn't know was there. And it's really why that local government is important, because they can help sometimes to guide you to some of those hidden records.
Right. And I think another aspect of at the local level, you mentioned isn't always just the birth, death, and marriage, but in every municipality across the state, there is a registrar of vital statistics, and they often have a good run of the vital statistics, the birth, deaths, and marriage records for that particular municipality available.
And they're, when I'm always going after those records, it's not only the direct ancestor of the person I'm researching. I always want the siblings and as many people possible in that family. But yeah, heading local for those vital statistics is really important.
Yeah, and it can save you a trip to Albany sometimes.
Yep.
So local governments, again, towns, villages, cities, counties, but there's also all these special purpose local governments as well. School districts have a lot of records, as well as things like soil and water conservation districts, and other sort of special kinds of organizations that might tell you about the work that someone did. Or a special project they were involved in, or in the case of schools, whether or not that person even attended that school. I'll just put a shameless plug here for the state archives. We support the work of local governments in protecting, managing, and in some cases preserving their important records. We have an ongoing program of grants, the Local Government Records Management Improvement Fund, which puts dollars back into municipalities to help them manage, preserve, and make available the records that they create. So we're trying to work in partnership with the local governments to help them meet the needs of researchers.
And that is such an important project and an important mission. And not every town has the same capabilities to preserve and make the records available as others. I quite often I've worked on projects or come across things where I can see the influence of the New York State Archives in making sure those records were preserved for me. Even if they're not in the building in Albany, they had a hand in making sure that those records are accessible.
Yep. And for many years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Genealogical Society of Utah, did a lot of microfilming of records in local governments across the state and made those records available through their product now called Family Search. And I know there are a number of places across the state, including here at the State Archives in Albany and at the State Library here in Albany, where you can log in to Family Search and search some of those local government records that were microfilmed a long time ago, but now they're also indexed and made available. Again, purely genealogical records.
Right, and the NYGB is also an affiliate library as well now. So you can if you're in New York City, you can come to our offices here and tap into that network as well. It's a fantastic resource for genealogical records.
Excellent. Can we talk a little bit about the NYGB's facility in New York? You know, there is a public research area.
Yeah, so we just finished actually remodeling our headquarters, and one of the reasons for that was to put in a space for an education center so that we can broadcast programs in and out, but also to make it friendlier for researchers coming in with a laptop. You know, the majority of resources that we can access are online, and so you're welcome to come in and plug in and get facility access through Family Search. We also have a new digitization center set up, where we're preserving other records from around New York City and New York State. So a lot of work going on, but you can absolutely come here and do research if you need to.
Excellent. Although I would caution everyone to not pass up an opportunity to visit the Fulton County Courthouse, because it's always sunny and beautiful and wonderful. This picture was taken yesterday. Not really. So let's move on from local government records, and let's talk a little bit about church records. And I want to highlight a particular collection that people may not necessarily be aware of. This is at the Buffalo State University in Buffalo, where there was a joint or multi-partner project to inventory and digitize the records of churches in Buffalo's East Side. And those resources are available through the digital collections at Buffalo State, which is in Buffalo, New York. But it's a great project to sort of working with churches and a local state university and the program, the urban planning program at big SUNY Buffalo, the big university center there, to again inventory, digitize, and make available the records from 65 churches across Erie and Niagara counties. Almost all of those churches, a huge percentage of them, were located on Buffalo's East Side. And what's great about this collection of records is it documents the churches, the histories of the churches, but also their members and what was going on in that particular part of the city and that particular part of the state. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that, you know, religious and church records are so important, not only to document, you know, things like a baptismal record or a marriage record, but the minutes and the sort of the week to week and day to day operations of a community. The stories and the people that you can learn about is really incredible. And so I encourage everyone to take a few moments and read through some of those materials that have been digitized as well. It's not just always that genealogical data from my perspective, at least. It's some of the history behind there.
And a number of the mainline, the larger religious organizations at the diocesan level or at a large scale church collective have records here. The Diocese of Albany maintains an archive for the Roman Catholic churches here in Albany. Down in New York, the collegiate churches have a pretty significant and very long-running set of records related to the group of Dutch Reformed churches that were in the city.
And actually, in the 1920s and 30s, the NYGBB had a project by a man named Mr. Vosberg, and Vosberg actually wrote to churches and organizations, primarily up and down the Hudson River Valley, asked about their records, and then sought to get a copy of their records for transcription purposes. And those are some of the resources at the NYGB's website. There's also copies on microfilm and in various places. But I always love reading the responses that he had from some of the organizations. You know, his attempt was to find out the condition of the records and do everything we could to preserve them. And sometimes you'll learn that a church didn't have records at that point. And sometimes you come across an entire set of records that Vosberg had found and identified that we didn't know about. So all sorts of good things in that collection.
And in your experience, particularly for some of the vital statistics about births and deaths, prior to 1880, the government didn't keep track of that.
Right.
So really church records wind up being an essential resource to identify some of that. Is that a fairly accurate statement?
Absolutely. I mean, religious records are one of the top substitutes that we have when vital records weren't recorded. I probably get asked every day, I'm trying to identify a marriage from New York in 1830, and where I went to the county and they didn't have the record. I said, well, the record doesn't exist at that government level. It might be at another institution. And so we had, right away to a local church and religious records to see if that particular event was documented.
So church records, and again, this East Side History Project is a wonderful example of a sort of a collective effort to ensure the preservation of a lot of records that might not have otherwise been preserved and certainly made available easily.
Absolutely.
And we're lucky that so many of, again, the bigger denominations and the bigger churches are taking a strong interest in ensuring the preservation of and access to their records. There are other sort of niche sort of collections. This is a great resource at Hunter College, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. They have a library and archives, which collects a huge amount of material about the Puerto Rican diaspora and the folks in New York, actually, I think across the state, and helping document institutions, people, programs, activities. And like other places, this has got a research room that's accessible. It's got a great preservation program and a great description program to enable people to find records that they otherwise might not know about and be able to discover them. It's a very much a focused collection, but it's a really important one. Again, in helping understand a particular community that had such an important, continues to have an important impact on the state. And there are a lot of people that are represented in these records.
Yeah, I mean, collections like this are so important because we have things like the federal census and others that might give just the surface, but these materials that really gather together the story of Puerto Ricans and their influence in the time in New York City and New York, it's an important collection to have and still valuable for research.
Mm-hmm. And it's accessible for research. They have finding aids for a large number of the collections that have been processed and organized and made available. They've got inventories of the records. And you can find this resource, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, online. And it's very easy to get to in terms of discovering them online and accessing the information on their collections. It's a great example of how to build a collection around a particular theme or a particular community. That's one example of a very focused collection. All across New York, there are 2,000 or more historical societies and museums. The Chemung County Historical Society, the St. Lawrence County Historical Association, almost the Montgomery County Department of Archives and History, all kinds of resources across the state where they have great libraries and great collections, not of government records, not necessarily of religious records, but they focus on the community that they're trying to document. Tremendous amount of material that's available. You've probably been to almost every historical society in this state, I would bet, Josh.
Not yet, though I've corresponded with quite a few, and I think it's important to remember. If you can't travel to all of these places, send an email, make a phone call, and learn more about what collections they have, and they might not be able to do the work for you, right? In that case, but you can always make that list of places to visit, and local oral history projects, for example, are the types of things that you'll find only at these great repositories.
Mm-hmm. And so we've got a couple of resources here on this slide that talk about two things. One, how to find what kinds of collections these repositories have. There's something called the Empire Archival Discovery Cooperative, or Empire ADC for those of us in the trade. And what it is, it's almost a union catalog of descriptions of collections in places like Chemung County Historical Society or the St. Lawrence County Historical Association that enable you to discover what is in their collections. It's a constantly growing and evolving collection of resources, but it's designed and it's intended to facilitate access to smaller repositories or smaller institutions that don't have a great big card catalog, or who don't have all that technology to enable you to get access to these really important but fairly small collections. The other thing is, though, where are those repositories? Where are those institutions? What's the address and the phone number of the Chemung County Historical Society? One of the resources that we provide here at the State Archives with our partners in the State Library and the State Museum is something called the Find New York Culture, which is really a portal that's designed to enable you to discover where these repositories are. So first, finding out what they have and if it's relevant to your research, that's where Empire ADC is so valuable. And then find out how to get in contact with them so that you can get to that repository. Using Find New York Culture will help you locate the specific repository and find out what their hours and availability is.
And I just want to emphasize the importance of using something like Empire ADC in your work. One of the things that I go after in a lot of my research is account books, and from whether it be a farm or a local blacksmith shop or a local store, and you would never realize where the account book of someone who operated in the community where your family lived in, and it's sitting at a local historical society or a museum, and you would never know it was there if it wasn't for sort of that collaborative effort to at least identify those. And then you have to figure out how to get to the repository as well. These things are not in online catalogs. They're not digitized yet. They're sitting and waiting for you to find them.
I think that's a really important point. Business records of these businesses that existed long ago or may still exist, they find their way to these kinds of institutions.
Yep.
And in business records, who worked there? How much did they get paid? What did they do? Or who sold goods to that business for them to do their business? All of that winds up being in what might be considered by some folks dry accounting books, but particularly 19th and 18th century accounting books, and even early 20th century accounting books are rich in detail, rich in all kinds of interesting information. You just have to know how to use them.
Right. And you have to think a little bit outside of the sort of direct family that you're tracing. It's not always going to be an ancestor's account book. It's thinking about, well, who did they interact with on a day-to-day basis in their local community, and what types of stories might be saved there.
Yeah. And my grandfather owned a lumber mill. Who would he have or she would have sold their lumber to?
Yeah, I had ancestors in the Cornwall, New York area that operated a summer home, and while I haven't found any accounting books, I have found a large number of advertisements clipped in local collections all around the state of New York. And so I always go in and look for summer homes and vacationing and see what I can find. It was eye-opening when I first started to venture down that pathway.
We, as an aside, we had a program here with the State Archives Partnership Trust, our speaker series, where some historians who were really interested in Alexander Hamilton used the Comptroller of New York, the Comptroller's account books, to get a better understanding of Hamilton's role at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. You wouldn't think of looking at an accounting book to understand how the Constitution was developed and what Alexander Hamilton's role was, but the truth was partly reflected in those payment records. It's a great resource. Accounting books are really, really cool stuff. So you've got local historical societies, but often those local history rooms in local public libraries have great resources. Similar, again, accounting books, but there's lots of other collections. I think the Daughters of the American Revolution, who did a lot of work across the state, often deposited their cemetery recording records, et cetera, in a local public library. Newspapers, of course, are there in the history room. All kinds of great resources show up there. I'm privileged to go to the Gloversville Free Library, or Gloversville Public Library now, which is the photograph here. They're reopening their local history room in April. It's been closed for a couple of years for renovation, but they're tremendously valuable resources. The Broome County Historical Society operates the research room at the Broome County Public Library, which is that research room that we've got the photograph up here in the corner. Fully staffed, great index, great resources. There are 700 public libraries across the state, over 700, and almost all of them have some kind of a local history room.
And, you know, don't ignore the small file cabinet in the corner, right? That looks like, you know, it might not have much. Those miscellaneous files, the surname files that oftentimes a local history room will have are invaluable. I was researching in Washington County, New York, and came across a public library, local history room that had a folder on a surname I was looking at, and you know there were Bible records copied in there. There were letters. There was all sorts of things that I hadn't anticipated to find, but they were safely stored in a cabinet, just waiting for me to discover.
And for so many of these local history rooms, they've been around for a long, long time. And there have been so many projects. I know in a couple of local history rooms, there's a name card file, and similar to the folder that you found. Okay, I'm going to look up Ruller, R-U-L-L-E-R. Oh my goodness, look at all these names with references to where they got some information about them.
Yeah, and you know, accessible resources, you know, local histories and genealogies that might have been indexed by card that help you to come across something you didn't know was there. And the Cornwall Public Library, when I was tracing that summer home, they have an amazing 3x5 index card file to the local newspapers. And it's by subject, it's by name, and you know, the full newspaper isn't yet digitized, but I have spent many hours in there actually pulling up local clippings, and it's just incredible. It's not only the name index, that subject index is so valuable as well. So
Yep. And again, connecting things, the name index and the subject index to the local newspapers. If you can identify the newspaper, the New York State Newspaper Project, which was run out of the state library, microfilmed those newspapers, and often you can get a copy of that microfilm on interlibrary loan to find the name and then go get the article, all through your local public library. Great resource. Well, I'm going to shift back to archives, and one of the great treasures we have here in New York is the New York City Municipal Archives. I'll say just down the street from you, but on the same island that you're on.
right.
Again, it's a fully functioning archives. It is larger, has a larger collection than what we have here at the state level. But again, one of the largest cities in the United States, with great resources, including vital statistics, of course, but they've got Dutch records and they've got modern records. Land records, et cetera. So many of the things that you might see in other local governments, you know, at the county level, are also present and available here at the city level. It's a great resource, and they've got a wonderful online catalog, which they've just recently introduced, but it's got all kinds of, and you can see it on the screen here, information on collections. You can look up individual names, look up individual subjects, and it's a wonderful resource.
You know, absolutely. I mean, I continue to be amazed by the types of materials that the Municipal Archives has in New York City. And the NYGB published a guide to the Municipal Archives several years ago. Things like bodies in transit records and records of local communities. The Municipal Archives has that fantastic photograph series of buildings in New York from the 1940s that they've made many of those available to view online. Just I think really the tip of the iceberg of what's sitting at the Municipal Archives for us for research.
And that's a really important book. I'm glad you brought that up, Josh. the NYGB's guide to the municipal archives. They can find out if people wanted to purchase that, they could get it information off of your website.
Yep. Yeah. Just go to newyorkfamilyhistory.org and information is there.
Perfect. Wonderful. Again, a really amazing resource that has records that span the length and breadth of the state almost, because of New York's incredibly far reach and influence. You talked about local public libraries. In addition to those libraries, New York academic libraries across the state in colleges and universities. Places like the Penfield Library in Oswego, which has the records from the Safe Haven Museum, which is a lot of information about those 1,000 Jewish refugees who were there during the Second World War. But lots of other resources, business records. In some cases, they're highly focused records. Here in Albany, the University at Albany has a great labor records collection. And then places like, Long Island University has done a huge amount of work collecting records. LIU has the records of Louis Armstrong, who lived just a short distance away in Jamaica. And but across the state, colleges and university libraries and special collections have, in many cases, very deep resources in topical areas, but also collecting from their community and collecting from around the region that college is located.
I know we talked about religious records earlier, and I'm always reminded of Cornell University's collection they have that documents religious life in Western New York. And when I first came across the collection, I was shocked to find it there. It's not every single denomination, but it's a place to go, and it's safely stored at that university level. So a place to search, absolutely.
I think finding things is one of the most important aspects. That's where you start your research. You got to find where the records or the records that might contain the answer that you're seeking are. There are a couple of other resources that are available here in New York. Obviously, going to places like NYGB or here to the State Archives to do some research in the collections that we've got available through Family Search or Ancestry.com. That's great. We mentioned the New York Empire, the Empire Archival Description Cooperative, Empire ADC. There's also something called the New York Heritage Digital Collections, where libraries and other repositories across the state have digitized materials, and they make them available through this online digital collection. It's a great resource. It's free, easy to find, easy to use. And again, you can do a lot of your research at home.
And I will say, I think I'm on New York Heritage almost every day with something. There's, records of the Home Land Company, for example, or just a sampling of what's there. There's city directories from different places. I was using city directories from Buffalo yesterday. It is just an absolutely amazing resource. And the thing that I'm always reminded of is when I find something on there, I always look at the repository and try to figure out and ask, well, what do you have that isn't yet part of New York Heritage Digital Collections? But yeah, the things you can do from home and the sources that you can access on there are just incredible.
Yep. And another similar resource that's been around for a very long time is something called the Historic Documents Inventory, which is a project that started in the mid-1970s to collect bibliographic records on collections and repositories across the state, bibliographic records, card catalog level information. We at the State Archives administer the Historic Documents Inventory, which sometimes shows signs of its age, but it's another resource to identify places where records about a topic you're interested in can be found. And so going to our website and finding the Historic Documents Inventory in our online catalog is another place to discover where records might be. I pulled up an example here of records from the Mohawk Cognawaga Museum and Tekakwitha Shrine in Fonda about some scrapbooks of Rufus Grider. That's a perfect, interesting topic for me. But starting out looking for things is where you've got to figure out where you want to go first before you start traversing the state.
And I love the HDI. One of the first mistakes I ever made in New York research was not knowing about the HDI before I planned a trip to the archives. And I had these entries and they said, oh no, that's part of the HDI. And then as soon as I realized what it was, I realized I have a catalog of local records all across New York. So now it's one of those checklist items I always make sure and search.
We've tried to cover a whole lot of different potential outlets, but I think one of the things that people need is, how do you learn how to do research? How do you learn how to form your questions and connect dots? And I know NYGB does a lot of this. Can you talk a little bit about that, Josh?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that is central to the NYGB's mission is preservation on one hand, but also education and helping individuals figure out, how do I formulate those questions? How do I use those documents? We have every other year we have a New York State Family History Conference, which is coming to Albany actually, and it'll be in Albany of September of this year. We're really excited to be live and in person, just blocks away from Tom and his fantastic team at the archives there. But it's really an event that's built around learning about record types and then learning how to use them. And our website has a number of webinars and articles and other resources. Again, it sometimes isn't enough just to find the materials, the municipal archives. It's how do I interpret them? How do I resolve conflicts that might happen between two types of records? And that's all the resources that we at the NYGBB offer. So there's a number of different things that you can explore, but by all means, visit newyorkfamilyhistory.org and you can get a sampling of what's there.
Cool. I'm looking at the questions that are starting to pile up. So I'll leave our program here. I'll leave this up for a minute. There's the website, newyorkfamilyhistory.org, to find out more about what the resources from the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society. And then, of course, here at the State Archives, we're here to help and help you do your research with the records that we preserve and make available. Josh, this has been a great conversation. It's always a great conversation talking to you. But now I'm going to turn it back over to Josie, and maybe we can start to field some of the questions that have come up.
Great. Thank you so much. There are some questions that have been rolling in, and a lot of them actually have been about links to some of the things you were talking about. So I tried while you were talking to add links into the chat, not the Q&A. So where you typed your question, not in that part, but in the part where it says chat, there should be a list of links. I did my best to do most of them, and we will email those to participants after the program as well. We also had some questions about synagogue records. Do you have any advice on people looking for those types of records?
So my best advice is to go to the Center for Jewish History in New York City. It's an incredible resource, knowledgeable staff, a great records collection, but that's sort of the number one place I would go to, is Center for Jewish History here in New York.
Because it's a conglomeration of a number of organizations and institutions that really, again, it's a collective to ensure that they have the capacity to provide access, to do appropriate preservation, and to do appropriate description of those records to enable people to find things. That's the perfect place to start. Absolutely.
Good. It's so important when you're starting out researching a topic to have just a place to start. So that's great information. We also had a question about, I actually have never watched Long Lost Family, but what somebody who joined us today did, and was surprised when researchers are able to obtain 20th century birth records with ease from many states. How are they doing that? How would one find 20th century birth records in New York State?
Well, there are two places, and I would just direct you to finding birth and death records here in New York. We've got a resource right on the State Archives website. If you go under the research tab, there's something called Vital Statistics or Vital Records, and it's got a very nice encapsulation of When records are available, there are certain records that are not available for disclosure for some period of time to protect people's privacy. So yes, the 20th century is not actually, it was 22 years ago, but in any event, but it'll tell you when records could become available and where those records are. We talked a little bit about at the state level, and the state has been collecting birth and death records since 1880. In New York City, they maintain them separately. Those are I'll say the upstate counties. But also those local registrars of vital statistics are an important resource. And don't ignore going to the city or the town to get information if things don't work out, or if there's not enough time or whatever to access the resources at the state level. But again, not all birth and death records are available immediately. It takes time, again, to protect the privacy of the individuals.
Great. So we have a question about how do historical societies get their records onto the New York Heritage digital collections?
If you go to the website, they've got information for contributors and how do you contribute. It's there is a bit of a requirement. I mean, you've got to have a decent digital image so that researchers can interact with it well. I can't just take a picture from my phone that's fuzzy and not all that great and send it out there, even if it's the most important thing in the world. But subscribing to some of the quality standards and then providing appropriate description of those records so that people can discover them and find them. You know, I want to make sure that I label the images or the resource appropriately. There's also the requirement that you've got to have the permission and the ability, the ownership, you know, the copyright to make those resources available. But on the New York Heritage website, there is information for contributors and how you make resources available.
Great. And New York Heritage is one of the links that I did put in the chat. So if you're looking for the link to that, it should be in there. How about you talked about some of the restrictions with vital statistics and vital records. Are there any restrictions on things like prison records? And this person in particular was wondering where they might look for state-run prison records between the 1870s and 1970s.
Well, here at the State Archives, we have one of the businesses of the government is to run prisons. So we have state level prison records, not of every prison, but we have a very good collection of state level prison records, particularly for the 19th century. And then after the turn of the century into the 20th century, we've got a good collection of records from Auburn and a couple of the other big prisons that were upstate. But as time has gone on, the volume of material that's produced about a particular inmate is overwhelming. So we have had to sample some of the case files of individuals in prison. So while we might be able to provide you with basic information on every single inmate in state prisons, we don't have a case file for every single inmate, particularly in the more modern era. But come to the State Archives, again, off of our website, under the research tab, there's research topics. One of the topics is prisons, and it will help you understand all of the various prison records that we preserve, and we have a lot of them.
And that is also one of the links that I did put in the chat. So if you're looking for that link, it should be in there. So we have a question about trial transcripts. Might somebody look for trial transcripts for a criminal trial in New York City?
If it's a local trial, I'd go to either the county clerk's office, any one of the 5 boroughs. The county clerk is the clerk of the court, and those records are preserved there. The mayor's court, the records are at the New York Municipal Archives. If they had a transcript of the trial itself. Sometimes those records are not necessarily preserved. Only the final decisions or judgments are preserved in the long term, because the trial transcripts can be pretty voluminous and hard to use.
Okay, somebody mentioned that they were not able to open the chat. So I hope I just fixed that, but let me know if I did not. let's see, I think that we did talk a little bit about the Cornell Library Church Records, but one of our participants wanted to make sure that everybody knows that there are records there. And I think that this has been a really good overview of, how a person might start a search and the different types of records that are available. And I hope that it's been helpful. And as I said, we can include some of these links that we've put in the chat, even if you aren't able to open it. I hope you are, in an email after the presentation. But I want to thank both of you very much for your time and for presenting this information today. And I also would like to thank everybody who joined us today. And I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. Please feel free to let us know. It is our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and would like to see more of it, please contact us at aptrust@nysed.gov to receive a free past issue of New York Archives magazine, which I highly recommend. Please join us on February 1st at 12:30 for our next New York Archives magazine online speaker series entitled Risk Takers and Change Makers, a conversation with Mary Liz and Paul Stewart, co-founders of the Underground Railroad Education Center. We'll be talking about the men and women whose efforts empowered the abolitionist cause and laid the foundation for today's civil rights movement in the United States. And for more information about that, you can visit our website at nysarchivestrust.org to learn more and to register for that event. Tom and Josh, thank you so much. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you,
Thank
Josie.
you.